Hello, everyone, and welcome to Skeptical Inquirer Presents. I am not Leanne Lord, and as a result, there will be no Star Trek references. I don't know anything about Star Trek, and I will not be anywhere near as humorous as your regular host, but I will do my best as a guest host. I am Stuart Vise. I am a contributing editor to Skeptical Inquirer magazine. And I also write a column there called Behavior and Belief. But tonight, I am going to just be the host and introduce our speaker. We're very fortunate tonight to have someone who is, without any real exaggeration at all, has to be considered one of the top researchers in the field of misinformation and how to combat it. And so, without any further rambling, I'm going to introduce him. His name is Sander van der Linden. He is professor of social psychology and director of the Cambridge Social Decision Making Lab in the Department of Psychology at the University of Cambridge. He's won numerous awards for his research on human judgment, communication, decision making, including the Rising Star Award from the Association for Psychological Science. He co-developed the award-winning fake news game Bad News and regularly advises governments, public health authorities, and social media companies on how to combat the spread of misinformation. He's ranked among the top 1% of highly cited social psychologists worldwide. He's published over 200 research papers. His research is regularly covered in the media, in New York Times, NPR, the Rolling Stone. I've never been in the Rolling Stone before. He currently serves as UK Cabinet Office National Security Risk Assessment. The serves on the UK Cabinet and the Office of National Statistics Citizens Data Advisory Group and the World Health Organization's Infodemic Alliance. Before joining Cambridge, he held academic positions at Princeton and Yale. He is the author of Foolproof. You're supposed to hold the book up. Foolproof, which was published in 2013. It was named to Nature's top science books, one of Nature's top science books. Also by the Financial Times. It was a Book of the Year recipient. And it was also received it's an amazing number of book prizes. It received prizes from the American Psychological Association, the British Psychological Association, and the Society for Personality and Social Psychology, as well as winning the Harvard Shorenstein Goldsmith Book Prize. And even more amazing, it also was reviewed in Skeptical Inquirer in this issue here very favorably by Terrence Hines, one of our regular reviewers, also a psychologist. His latest book, which I can also hold up, is The Psychology of Misinformation. Oops, I should hold it up the right way. The Psychology of Misinformation. And it was the Cambridge Press Book of the Year for 2004. So we are very fortunate today to have Sander with us. And Sander, with that, I'm going to ask you to take it away with your talk, which I believe is titled Psychological Inoculation Against Misinformation.
Well, thank you so much, Stuart, for that tremendously generous introduction. I like Terrence's review. He was a little bit cranky about the gameplay. So if people have suggestions on how to improve it, always welcome. Um, it is midnight for me here, so I'm going to do my best to be as sharp as possible. But I've never given this talk at midnight, so it'll be the first one for me. But I really want to do this because you know, I've been a skeptic myself for a very long time. It's actually what got me interested in science. I wasn't always in science, and actually before I became a scientist, I was a skeptic, which motivated me to go back to university actually. So I'm very fond of this community, and it's my pleasure to talk to you today about some of the research that we've been doing. Let me see if I can share my screen.
I'm gonna duck out.
Just let me know if this is showing up all right. Stuart, is this good? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So, I know I'm talking to a professional community of debunkers, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on the philosophy of misinformation, and but it is worth noting that there is some heated debate about what is misinformation and how to best counter it, even among skeptics, among misinformation researchers. So I just want to give you my take. So all of these stories were widely reported. Two of them are fake. Which one's true? When I do this with a live audience, it's kind of interesting because most people actually think that B is the right answer. A baby born in California was named Hard Eyes Emoji. When I give this talk in California, most people in California think that the answer is B. Seems like that would happen in California. But the right answer is actually C. This really happened in Missouri. So some guy was making a break for it, and the he was hiding in the bushes and he passed gas so loudly that he gave away his own hiding place. And the sheriff's department tweeted, "When you're having a hashtag shit day." So that was a real story. I mean, it sounds too weird to be true, but actually, it was true. And the question that we've been thinking about for a long time is how do people know what's true and false, and how can you actually measure this? So one of the things that bothered me about this field is that, we give people kind of a random sequence of headlines, and then we ask people, is this true, false, accurate? And there, unlike other areas of psychology, such as personality or assessment, we didn't have a standardized scale to assess people. So we actually spent a few years creating this thing called the misinformation susceptibility test, which is free. Anyone can take it. You get a score in terms of how naive or gullible you are, if you say everything's false or everything's true, versus how discerning you are. And you might be skeptical about the idea of a misinformation susceptibility test because news is different in different countries. What's true might change over time for some things. But actually, we did retest over several years in different countries, and we found that it's actually a pretty stable test, and it correlates with all the existing scales, and it actually outperforms most existing conspiracy theory scales in terms of predicting people's ability to discern. So people do have this sort of latent uh, dimension, and we use graph theory and all sorts of different methodologies to try to sort of get at what is this underlying ability. But people do seem to differ in their ability to get a good score on this test. And so some people are more susceptible than others, and this is called differential susceptibility. Which fits kind of with my viral analogy, which I'll be appealing to throughout the talk. But we actually created this test using neural networks to ensure that nobody had actually seen any of the items before, because otherwise it's kind of a memory test, right? If you know that it's true because you've seen it before, or that somebody's told you that it's false, then it's not really a good test of your ability. Then you're just retrieving knowledge, right? So we actually had an AI create the false headlines way before ChatGPT was cool. Yeah, it's kind of an interesting way to approach psychology actually using AI. So Morning Joe actually did this test with some people in the US, and what's interesting is that young people, so ages 18 to 29, are most susceptible. I mean, they perform the worst on this test, and that's been pretty reliable evidence. So what is this test? So here you can see, so YouGov uses the MIST. Has benchmarked it against the US population. So here you can see certain vaccines are loaded with dangerous chemicals and toxins. 58% think that's false. 42% think that's true. I mean, that's kind of shocking. This is a national YouGov poll. This was before RFK Jr. So I don't even want to know what the numbers are now, probably. But governments are manipulating the weather to cause devastating storms. Um, and so if you look at what correlates with this, right? So people who perform the worst, they get their news from Truth Social and TikTok and WhatsApp, and people who do better, you know, get their news from NPR, the Associated Press. We've talked about Gen Z doing worse than other generations, and maybe that's correlated because they get most of their news from social media. So that seems to be one potential explanation. But lots of things correlate with this test, and we've had about 500,000 people go through this, and we just published a paper about with 60,000 people from 28 countries, and the results are pretty stable. Now, I don't have to convince you guys of the importance of misinformation. In the UK during the pandemic, we had people set phone masts ablaze because they thought 5G was causing the coronavirus, millions of damage and dangerous stuff. Not just a Western phenomena, right? So in Iran, people, including kids, were ingesting methanol because they read on social media that it would cure the virus. There were many excess hospitalizations. In the UK, last year we had the Southport riots, nationwide riots, because of a false story that leveraged a real tragedy to suggest that an immigrant arrived by boat and attacked young girls. I mean, somebody did attack young girls, but it wasn't an immigrant who arrived by boat. But nonetheless, it provided fuel for the fire for the far right to capitalize on this issue. Here we have a military convoy heading to Ukraine. This is a cheap fake. This went viral on Facebook during the conflict with Russia, Ukraine. This is Southern California. Putin's claim that he was targeting Nazis. I don't have to remind you guys of the Capitol riots, which was based on the conspiracy that the election was stolen. Israel, Hamas, tons of manipulated imageries, Gen AI, out of context information, RFK. Um, every scientific journal is horrified at the moment about the anti-science rhetoric that's coming out of the administration. I'm based in the UK, so I feel comfortable saying this on record. Um, um, During the LA protest, AI generated, fake videos, ChatGPT spouting out nonsense. It's just there's a lot of stuff going on that's not good and confusing people out there. And my interest is not to be the arbiter of truth, despite some social media jokes, shall we say. I'm actually interested in propaganda techniques. So here's a good example that makes this clear. So, when COVID vaccine came out, people had questions about the mRNA vaccine. It was new, right? And so, sure, people should have questions. They should be skeptical. But what I'm interested in is this trope that the vaccine is going to change your DNA. So, actually, what interests me is that the technology is new, but this idea is actually not new. If you go back to the first vaccine, the modern vaccine, which was, of course, Edward Jenner's cowpox vaccine against smallpox, and you look at art from the 1800s, early 1800s, the first anti-vaccine activists, the first idea that they had was to fearmonger that the vaccine was going to change your DNA, change your body. They didn't have the word DNA yet, but the idea was that if you took it, you were going to turn into a human-cow hybrid. Here's an example of their propaganda. You would have udders sprouting out of your mouth and ears, and the whole idea was that if you took the vaccine, you were going to turn into a human-cow hybrid, meant to scare people off from the vaccine. So what's so different between saying that this new vaccine is going to change your DNA, right? It's the same trope 200 years later, but somehow we fail to anticipate these techniques that are being recycled throughout history, and that's my kind of interest. So what do I mean by misinformation? False or misleading information, including human error. And I'll come back to the importance of misleading, because when we say false, we tend to think of flat Earth conspiracies and that kind of stuff. But actually, I'm much more concerned about misleading information. Disinformation is then misinformation coupled with some psychological intention to deceive or harm other people. And propaganda is disinformation in the service of an agenda, whether that's commercial or political. And I don't like the term fake news so much because it's so politicized, but it is good to be precise, right? I'm much more concerned about disinformation than I am about misinformation, but it's difficult to prove intent in certain circumstances. There have been very well documented examples, for example, the tobacco industry and fossil fuel industry, but in real time it can be tricky. So I use the term misinformation to be conservative. But in a consensus statement that I led for the APA, we define misinformation actually in the broadest possible way. So we're saying any information that is false or otherwise misleading, regardless of source or intention. And this was actually quite important because credible sources can also spread misinformation, and that's often much more damaging than some crank website that nobody pays attention to. The New York Times spread misinformation about weapons of mass destruction during the war in Iraq, right? So that's they apologized for that. They said, okay, we did spread misinformation and we're going to try to correct the record. That's what a good editorial outlet does instead of doubling down, right? BBC, false balance on climate change, always had skeptics on, while 97 or more percent of scientists agree that humans are causing climate change. So credible outlets, right? So we tend to teach people about sources in schools, right? Or that, this is a good source, this is a bad source. But in some countries, you don't have good sources. They're all government controlled, for example, or in authoritarian regimes. And so we didn't really find it helpful to necessarily think of source as being the right cue. And intention is hard to verify, right? It's psychologically. So we said, false or misleading, regardless of intent or source. Um, and here's the point that I want to make about our definition. Um, this study looked at fact-check misinformation on Facebook about vaccinations during COVID, and they found, yeah, sure, people, if you're exposed to fact-check misinformation, you're less likely to get the vaccine. But if you were exposed to misinformation that wasn't fact-checked because it was more misleading than overtly false, the impact on vaccine attitudes and intentions was 50 times greater than that of fact-check misinformation. And that's, I think, the core of the problem. So here's an example of what we mean. A healthy doctor died 2 weeks after getting COVID vaccine. CDC is investigating why. This wasn't fact-checked as false because technically a healthy doctor did die 2 weeks after getting the COVID vaccine. Except a manipulation technique is being used here, which is the conflation of causation with correlation, right? So there's falsely a causal link is implied here, while there was mere co-occurrence. One had nothing to do with the other. So there's important context missing, right? It's a framing technique. And in fact, turned out that indeed one had nothing to do with the other, but people are going to take away that one implies the other, right? Because of the framing technique that's being used without any further context. And so those type of headlines do much more damage than outright misinformation, and that's why we think this should be part of the overall definition of misleading misinformation. And so that's kind of an important distinction, and that's why a lot of our interventions focus on misleading news, not so much the smaller bubble of 100% fake news. And so if you do the type of work that I do, which is trying to understand how misinformation spreads on networks, one of the things that early on we tried to do, and this is a really neat paper that borrows models from epidemiology, that models how viruses spread, and you apply that to how conspiracy theories spread, for example, 5G. So here they looked at a SIR model, which is about being susceptible, infected, recovered, which is used for a lot of viruses. You can turn that easily into a model for the spread of misinformation, right? Instead of being infected, you now believe in a conspiracy, right? And in terms of spread, you have posted or not posted a particular tweet. And if you no longer believe the conspiracy, you move to the, kind of recovery node of the model. And so actually, if you look at the data, this fits empirical data really well. And so we started thinking, right, about this idea, well, if misinformation kind of spreads like a virus, and so I'll show you some more work on this at the end of the talk that we work on, kind of, more kind of mathematical models of how information spreads using epidemiology. It seems to make sense that we were able to think of the idea of, well, maybe we can inoculate or vaccinate people against misinformation. And if you look at the current approaches, we mostly look at fact checking and debunking, which is good. I'm not going to say debunking is bad, but if you look at the evidence, the meta-analyses on fact checking and debunking, it's just a struggle, right? So on average, debunking reduces misperceptions, but it doesn't eliminate them because of the continued influence of misinformation, right? So our memories are kind of like a network. So your concepts are nodes in this network and they have links. And so once you integrate misinformation into your memory network, it makes friends with other things. So there's hundreds of links. So it becomes a game of whack-a-mole. If you integrated a myth into your mental model, it's now linked with hundreds of other concepts. And so when you reason, those links can be activated. And so when you try to correct something, you might correct and undo a few links, but others are going to keep popping up. And that's the struggle with debunking and fact checking. A more practical struggle is that debunks and fact checks don't go viral, but misinformation does. So you're always running behind the curve, and sometimes people don't want to engage with your debunk or the fact check for identity reasons, right? A recent meta-analysis actually showed a zero effect of science-relevant debunking. And that's a bit depressing. There's huge heterogeneity in this meta-analysis, though. People debate about this. I think debunking can be useful if you do it well, following best practice guidelines. But if you don't do it well, you typically get a null effect. The whole sort of backfire thing, I think, is much more contested. I think we now sort of believe that backfire is pretty rare, where people double down if you try to debunk them. Extremists do that, but most of the general population does not tend to do that. But still, which, there's neurological evidence for this. Put people in the scanner and you see what's going on. Um, there's two different explanations that are kind of leading. One is people fail to integrate the correction into their mental model of how something works, which is called an integration error. And the other has to do with the retrieval error. So when we access information in the brain, you access true and false information concurrently, and false information is supposed to be tagged as false, and then you have to suppress it during retrieval. And then something goes wrong in that suppression process, and so people end up retrieving the falsehood despite the correction. And so the problem here is that if you keep repeating the misinformation as part of the correction, there's a somewhat of a risk that you keep activating the misinformation. And if the correction is too long, too boring, too scientific, doesn't resonate with people, people are going to forget about the correction and they're just going to think about the myth that they've now heard and heard again and again. Um, and so instead of debunking, we've been working for the last decade or so on this idea of pre-bunking or psychological inoculation, which tries to prevent people from encoding misinformation in the first place. And it follows the vaccine analogy. So what is inoculation? Actually, it follows the vaccine analogy exactly. Just as vaccines expose people to a weakened dose of a pathogen to try to trigger the production of antibodies, right, to help confer resistance against future infection, it turns out you can do the same with the brain. And Bill McGuire, who was a social psychologist, very famous social psychologist, originally came up with this idea. He didn't end up developing it into kind of a modern context. He did some initial lab experiments that seemed promising, but he sort of took, and in fact Aristotle probably came up with it because he was talking about preempting snake oil salesmen in ancient Greece and protecting the public from their manipulation tactics. And so, it goes back thousands of years. But the key idea is that you expose people to a weakened dose of the misinformation, and then you refute that misinformation or the techniques used to produce misinformation in advance so people can build up psychological antibodies and become more resistant to misinformation to the full dose in the future. And those psychological antibodies can be measured very precisely in terms of how well people are at discerning between credible and not credible content, how motivated they are to resist, their memory of the content, physiological measures related to arousal. We're doing some fMRI work at the moment, so there are lots of ways that you can get that you can conceptualize the resistance that forms in the brain. But the idea is really based on this notion of not just giving people facts, but giving them a weakened dose of the misinformation, and persuasively exposing the playbook in advance of misinformation producers so that people become more immune. That's really the idea. So psychologically, there's kind of a warning element that's important because people tend to not pay attention. So we have it's kind of a truth bias. From an evolutionary perspective, that makes sense because if you have to critically appraise every single detail, you wouldn't get on with your day. So we assume that most things are true, which works in some environments, but not when you're in an environment where all of a sudden most people are lying, or influential people are lying, or the quality of the information isn't good, right? So we need to forewarn people that they may be misled to trigger deception monitoring mechanisms. And then we need to preemptively refute a future falsehood, and that's the refutational preemption or the pre-bunk. So we've relabeled that pre-bunking, and then people build up the resistance. Now, I've done lots of lab studies on that. And people come into the lab, and then you give them a weekend dose, and then you refute it, and then you let people browse the internet, and you find they become more immune. I don't have too much time today, so I don't want to take you through too many of those older studies. But there were some funny headlines about Cambridge scientists consider fake news vaccine. A journalist even called us asking if this was fake news. But the idea was that you can now vaccinate people against misinformation, at least to some extent. But they were actually asking us, okay, but okay, so you get people into the lab, they read your 500 word pre-bunk, and then you let them browse a website, and they're armed with a with a preemptive, they have the ability now to sort of resist misleading arguments. But how does that work in the real world? You can't just get people into the lab and get them to read a 500 word essay and so on. And so we thought that was a good point. And so we took some inspiration from Severus Snape because Cambridge kept referring to us as the Defense Against the Dark Arts Lab. Um, and I started looking, this is not my generation, but I started looking into the stories, and I found this quote from Severus Snape. This is my ode to Alan Rickman more than anything. But uh, he said, your defenses must be as flexible and inventive as the arts that you seek to undo. And what intrigued me about the Defense Against the Dark Arts class was that, unlike the other courses, which is kind of akin to traditional media literacy, where you sit and you read the book and you learn all the things, all the facts, you actually engage with the dark arts. It's kind of dangerous. You kind of fight them off in a simulated, weakened sense, and then you overcome it by learning how it works from the inside out. It was a little bit dangerous. And so we took inspiration from that, and that's how we created Bad News, which was the first fake news game at the time. And Bad News is a social media simulation. And we spent a couple of years interviewing producers of misinformation. Because the other thing is you can inoculate people against a specific myth. So we started on things like climate, right? That 97% of climate scientists agree that humans are causing climate change, right? But there's industries trying to sow doubt about the consensus, but using fake experts, and that's a technique, and here's how that works. And then, yeah, people become more immune when they come across false balance arguments, and they preserve their sense of scientific consensus. But that doesn't scale to it's not a broad spectrum vaccine. It's a narrow spectrum vaccine. It's one strain, right? So the idea was how could we create a broader spectrum vaccine? And so we started interviewing producers of misinformation to get at the general DNA of like what does all misinformation have in common? What are the building blocks that are used over and over again? Um, and can we vaccinate against those larger building blocks? And so we interviewed people who work in Russian troll farms, people who do this for a living, right? Neo-Nazis, far-right extremists. And so one of the things that we decided to do was to put people into a simulation. So in Bad News, you actually take the perspective of the person who's trying to manipulate you online, and your goal is to gain as many followers as possible without losing credibility. So nothing about facts here. It's actually a simulated attack. So the idea was that we're going to simulate attacks that might happen to you in the future on social media. A weakened dose, it's controlled, it's fictional. We use humor, right? So it's nobody's actually going to be duped, kind of like a vaccine. You don't want to infect people with the virus, right? But you want it to be strong enough to stimulate defenses, but not so strong to overwhelm the immune system. Um, and the goal is to master it. So here you have Donald Trump. We've updated the game now, with the elections. I'm back. Great idea, Joe. By executive order, I'm renaming Canada to North Dakota. Hashtag you got annexed. We came up with this joke 3 years ago when we thought this was a joke. Something that Trump maybe would say but didn't actually say, but now we might have to change this because he has actually said something similar to this. So, uh, but bear with me for a second. The idea here is actually not about what is being said, but about the account. This is part of our impersonation strategy. When we were doing this research, we're like, well, it's not just fake experts, right? Impersonation is a much larger thing, impersonating doctors, celebrities, official organizations. Um, and so most people fail to notice this on our little pre-test, like our fake news quiz that we give people at the beginning. But once we take them through weakened doses of how manipulation with impersonation happens online, people become more resistant. The mainstream media has one massive conspiracy, hashtag fake news. Here's Elon Musk. Doge investigation confirms that Prime Minister Keir Starmer was the inspiration for Mr. Darcy from hashtag Bridget Jones' Diary. What else are the Brits hiding? John Rosenbeek, who worked with me on this, who is the other co-creator, is responsible for a lot of the humor in the game. So if you have complaints, talk to John. But basically, this is about trolling, right? Elon is a master troll. So one of the scenarios in the game is trolling. Here we're impersonating NASA. And so you start trending and people respond to you, right? It's interactive. They're cheering you on. You create your own echo chamber. You filter bubble, right? And things get worse from there on out. Now, if you're being too ridiculous, you lose all credibility because that's not what a clever manipulator would do. So what are these techniques? It's about polarization, right? Get two groups in society polarized. Pick an issue, abortion, LGBTQ, immigration. Get two camps polarized. Impersonation, conspiracy theories, trolling, fear-mongering emotions, discrediting, using sowing doubt, right? Like the tobacco and fossil fuel industries have done. Now, importantly, and this is very important, the emotion level, it's not about emotions are bad. That's not what this level is about. It's about the appeal to emotion fallacy, right? Which is fallacious. Discrediting. Fact checkers discredit people using facts and science. That's not what this is about. This is about using denial tactics, right? Using sowing doubt. And so this is specific to misinformation. And so people go through these levels and then we test them before and after. I mean, this thing went viral unexpectedly on Reddit. It didn't say Cambridge, nothing. There's no intro to this game. It's random. People find out when they're playing what this is about. And so again, it's based on reality because this actually happened. Somebody impersonated Warren Buffett on Twitter, got hundreds of thousands of followers, and then tweeting out nonsense investment advice. But you see, there's a T missing. So it's the Trump example, right? So we model it after real world events, but it's fictional because it's a weakened dose. So here's John with the lovely curls. John Rosenbeek. So this went viral. This was just an opt-in sample. It was a live experiment and field experiment, very short quiz, pre-post. Um, we had hundreds of thousands of people go through this game, about, between 1 and 10% of people at the time opted into scientific research, so totally opt-in sample. We had about 30,000 data points. The backstory is that we were going in schools before with a paper version of this game. When we were messing around with this, we had a paper-based version that we went into schools with, and then we realized we got 50 people after a year of planning, and it didn't scale very well. So that's why we went online and got massive samples all of a sudden. So here you have reliable information that doesn't make use of manipulation techniques. People find that reliable before and after playing, but for the items that contain the manipulation techniques, kind of like the game examples that I've showed you, people find that significantly less reliable. Now, importantly, we don't ask people, is this true, is this false? We're not interested in promoting overly simplistic ideas about truth. We're asking people to calibrate a judgment on a scale of 1 to 7. How reliable, how accurate, how trustworthy, how manipulative is this? We don't want to tell people what they need to believe. We want to, cultivate critical thinkers. If there's a manipulation technique present, you should be more skeptical, right? And that's the effect that we're going for. Didn't matter if you were left, right, young, old. This density distributions, these are medians, the dots. People start at different levels, differential susceptibility, but the intervention effect is the same for all of these groups, more or less. So that was promising. Now, lots of complaints about this research design from a nerdy kind of academic perspective, right? It wasn't controlled, no placebo, could be item effects because the game's expensive to host. This cloud space, you can't just ask people 100 questionnaire, 100-item questionnaire. That's just not possible. And then people don't want to play the game if you bore them with too many questions, right? So we took this in the game into a lab setting and then started doing randomized controlled placebo trials, pre-registered randomized controlled trials. In the control group, people did Tetris, gamified control. And then also we started thinking about, okay, so there's this immunity. So the boost was about 25% from pre to post test. People become 25% better on average at spotting these manipulation techniques. Um, but how long does it last, right? Because that was another question. So what I'm going to show you here is kind of the setup of all of these experiments. Raccoon, who is now at Oxford, did his whole PhD on figuring out the decay of the intervention. So you play Bad News, which is 15 to 20 minutes, right? It's a game, or you play Tetris. We got lots of messages from people for paying them to play Tetris for 20 minutes. But yes, if you were in the control group, because Tetris is fun. And then so you do a pre-test. And so we had more capabilities now. We had 18 items, 3 items for each of the 6 techniques. So 3 items for liability reasons. So that's 18. You get randomized inoculation control. And then we started following up with people. So we bombard people with misinformation. It's called the misinformation attack. It's a bit nefarious, but we follow up with people immediately, but then week after week after week after week for a period of 3 months. So we could see how long the effect lasts. We get ethics approval for this, obviously. The idea that the benefit outweighs the risk of if this intervention works, right? And we debrief people afterwards when the final thing's over. In the second experiment, exactly the same. We just follow up with people at the end. No intermediate testing. Third experiment, we mash up the items because maybe people are just remembering their answers or something, and so we actually have different items, right? And so the idea of the game is actually that if you're inoculated against conspiracy theories, we're now going to bombard you with a whole range of conspiracy theories, right? And the idea is not that you're going to have 100% immunity against every possible conspiracy theory, but you're going to have some immunity against a broad range of them because you understand the building blocks because they all have the same predictable plot. And we use an acronym for this: conspire. There's incoherence, nefarious intents, something must be wrong, overriding suspicion. Tupac Shakur is still alive on an island. Avril Lavigne is a clone. Princess Diana is still alive. Oh no, actually, she was murdered by the royal family. A lot of these, Beyonce didn't really have a baby. Oh, maybe Megan also didn't really have a baby. They all follow the same formula, and that's why they're so ridiculous. And so that's kind of the idea, right? Now you can be specific and get 100% if you want to do specific inoculation, but we're going for broad spectrum, right? Um, so here's the idea, right? So pre-test, nothing going on here. People do the intervention, significantly less likely. This is the average rating of the 18 items. People find fake news less reliable. And this stayed stable, though, for the whole period. So except the raccoon and the student, I mean, that's not possible. Even with COVID vaccine, with real vaccines, they wear off over time. Something fishy going on here. And so actually what we found was actually problematic for his PhD because his whole PhD was based on the effect declines, and we need to model the decline. But if there's no decline, that was kind of a problem. So a bit of motivated reasoning on our part, perhaps. But actually, in the second experiment, we did find what we were looking for. That you can see there's still an intervention effect here, right? There is still a difference between control and inoculation. These are the densities, right? So it shifts to the left, but it's creeping up again. You can see people find misinformation more reliable again. I mean, this is a 50% decay of the effect. And later, what we confirmed is that we were actually boosting people by engaging them with this quiz at every testing interval. Because it turns out what predicts the longevity, and this is a paper in Nature Communications that we recently published over all possible, 3 different types of inoculation over very long time periods for social psychology at least. We can model exactly what's going on. And what we find is that there's 2 mechanisms. One is memory, people forget, and the other is motivation. People lose motivation to resist. And so what's happening is that the quiz was priming people's memory and making them motivated again about the dangers of misinformation. And so you can actually boost people. So here you can see the decay. There's an exponential forgetting curve, essentially. So people forget over time. But then the blue bar is the boost. So if you boost people with the quiz, with the replay, with a short reminder, it could be anything, you can actually maintain a large proportion of the effect. then we started thinking about how can we make this more realistic, right? There's political divisions in society, right? Misinformation isn't just in the abstract. People had criticisms. Wow, you guys, you create stylistic, items that aren't, provocative with regards to politicized sources, because we wanted to rule out source confounds at the beginning. So then we graduated to, okay, well, let's take the US context, hyperpolarized. Let's come up with a conspiracy theory about Uber creepy, tracking your every move. And then we just vary the source. Same headline, CNN or Fox News. Interestingly, so people find misinformation, this is a pretest, more reliable if it comes from your in-group. So there you do have that effect, right? If the misinformation is from your preferred source, you're going to find that information more reliable. So that's interesting. But the intervention effect, of course, is the largest for inoculation without a source, but it's still there, even for the in-group. It's just less. So yes, identity does reduce the inoculation effect a little bit, but it doesn't eliminate it. And it still improves discernment, right? So this is discernment. So people are better at discerning between manipulative and non-manipulative information following the intervention. Once we had enough evidence, the Foreign Office in the UK government helped us translate that news into every major language around the world. So we could do large cross-cultural testing, and we worked with local organizations in different parts of the world. There's been meta-analyses of these games and others, and overall, the effects are. As is funny, when I wrote this book, there were some journalists with like, oh yeah, yeah, vaccine, but he's talking about 20%, or what kind of vaccine is that? And so, I feel like it would be misleading, right, to claim that you get 100% immunity, because that's not what's happening here. I mean, human psychology is variable. There's a lot of interference. Achieving anything, in my experience with people, is a major win. So, on average, there's a D of 20, which is a small to modest effect in psychology. And I'll show you a bit more about small effects later on. But it's robust, it's reliable, it helps people, and this often as good as it gets for a social scientist. I mean, we're not dealing with universal physics laws here. So I was pretty happy with that. I think it would be a misunderstanding to think that you're going to vaccinate someone and now they're 100% immune. I mean, that's just not how it works. And then some people thought like maybe making people too skeptical. And we were really taken aback by that, because as a good, we want people to be skeptics, right? Not cynical, but skeptical. But then, a lot of people are like, yeah, people should trust the New York Times. They shouldn't be skeptical of the New York Times. Our approach was more like, well, if the New York Times publishes a headline that's misleading, uses a manipulation technique, and our colleagues come with this all the time. They say, oh yeah, look, the New York Times publishes a emotionally manipulative headline about COVID, right? In the other direction, like, oh, so many people are dying or something like that. And but you have to be fair and balanced. I mean, fear mongering is fear mongering, no matter which direction it goes. And so that just makes people more skeptical of the headline. They're not all of a sudden going to stop trusting the New York Times, right? So because that would be cynicism. That's not what we want. But skepticism about specific headlines, that's a good thing in my book. Other people disagree. We don't want people to be skeptical of the BBC and the New York Times in this political climate, and so on. So we thought, okay, what's a good middle ground? So we thought, well, what if we give people feedback about how they're doing? Because in the immune system, part of how your immune system is optimized is through feedback, about invaders and healthy cells. And so we give people feedback. And sometimes when people are being too skeptical, we say, look, even Freud said sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, right? Not everything is manipulation. You have to pay attention. That massively boosts discernment. So people find real news more reliable, fake, misinformation less reliable. So we've calibrated our interventions, and it's actually a spectrum. We can make people very skeptical, a little bit skeptical, moderately skeptical. We don't feel it's like a value judgment to some extent. We don't feel like there's a good answer to that, but we're trying to calibrate to what people think is a good consensus of how skeptical people should be. And so it's dynamic, right? This is kind of signal detection stuff. So you can reduce false alarms that people think something is manipulation when it isn't manipulation through feedback, for example, if you want to reduce the amount of errors in an intervention. We have a version for kids. When we started scaling this during the pandemic, we were able to partner with the World Health Organization. We created a 5-minute version called Go Viral, which looked at conspiracies, impersonating doctors, fake advice, medical advice, and conspiracies. Very short game, 5 minutes. Then the United Nations came in. And this turned out to be a massive campaign. This is the first time that we did it for real in a public health campaign. So we reached about 200 million people with this inoculation campaign during the early stages of the pandemic. It became one of the most popular pages on the WHO page, a game. And so that was, that was good. We did randomized trials beforehand to make sure it works. It uses the same principles as bad news. You join this group called Not Go Afraid, and you learn that kiwis actually cure the virus. We did. I'm not going to say too much about this because it's recorded. There's an executive order out on Chris Krebs, who we worked with on this intervention. But the goal was that we wanted to protect Americans from foreign interference. So we spent time studying the playbook with Chris on how foreign actors influence American society to disrupt elections. They find an issue. Should you put pineapple on pizza? Then they're gonna get the Italians riled up, right? Oh, that's offensive. Putting pineapple on pizza, that's totally offensive. And then the other side's gonna say, well, this is America, buddy. Nobody's gonna tell me what to put in my pizza. Don't interfere with my pizza topping freedom. And then you buy bots to amplify both sides, and now you have chaos. Of course, they don't do that with pineapple pizza. Chris came up with this pineapple pizza metaphor for the game, which was great. They do it on abortion, immigration, right? And so we launched that intervention during the 2016 elections, just before Trump fired Chris. I'm just going to move on from that for now. The last 5 minutes, I want to talk about Google. So Google came to us and said, we've read your papers, the games are cool, but you have this massive problem. It's opt-in. People have to be open-minded to come to your interventions, right? How are you going to scale this on social media? 20 minute, even a 5-minute game. It's a fun science experiment run amok, but it's not good enough for social media. And so we said, okay, so what do you propose? They said we need to do videos. So 30 seconds, 60-second videos. We own YouTube, and those annoying ads that you can't skip on YouTube. What if we did pre-bunk videos? So the whole idea, and now I think my NDAs are probably expired by now, and since all social media companies are walking back their efforts to combat misinformation, I feel less inclined to stick to them. But technically, they can or cannot say that there is misinformation on YouTube or how they can detect it or not. But let's hypothetically say that you would be exposed to misinformation and that their algorithm would know hypothetically that you might be exposed to not so credible content, then they could insert the pre-bunk automatically, and even tailor it, right? So we spend some time creating these videos. So you may be targeted, the forewarning, then you get the weekend dose. Here's scapegoating, which is and this was less about news, more about how political gurus on YouTube radicalize people, for example, right? And how they present news in a misleading way. And then you get some more microdoses to see what it looks like. And of course, they were very concerned about how it's perceived politically. They didn't want to talk about climate, abortion, vaccines. So I said, can you create a weekend dose that's not live, but inactivated, completely neutral? And so we went back to popular culture, and actually, John came up with some good examples that we actually think are pretty good. So we did all these lab experiments that showed, basically inoculation control. You get this test, manipulative versus a neutral version of the same post, and it worked like a train. I'll show you here in reverse. So these are the lab effects: emotional manipulation, false dilemma, scapegoating, ad hominem attacks. People are better at discerning, they find it less trustworthy, they're less willing to share that stuff with other people. Very consistent effects, quite big effects for the lab, actually. Then the journal said, but you need to show that this actually works on YouTube now. And that was the final step. It took us years to negotiate because YouTube doesn't work with outside scientists. It all had to go through Google. Google was trying to convince them. About a year later, they convinced Google to let us run an actual campaign doing this. And so there was an inoculation video campaign. a control campaign. I saw some video about freezer burn. So what was the weakened dose? So let's take the false dilemma one, which is one of my favorites. Politicians love to use false dilemma. So after a mass shooting, if you don't support semi-automatic rifles, you're against the Second Amendment. That's a false dilemma. If you support this country, then you're against this country. False dilemma, right? Misinformation producers love to use that. But what's a weakened dose that has zero harm potential, that can't be misunderstood, and that's non-political? So here we go. I don't know how many Star Wars fans. Oh, Stuart, you're talking about Star Wars. Oh no, Star Trek, I think. I'm going to talk about Star Wars. This is Revenge of the Sith. Um, Obi-Wan Kenobi is talking to Anakin Skywalker, who of course goes on to become Darth Vader. Spoiler alert. And he says, if you're not with me, then you're my enemy. And to which Obi-Wan replies, only a Sith deals in absolutes. I'm not going to do the whole, but you get the idea, right? And it's the template. If you're not with me, then you're my enemy. That's the template of every false dilemma. That's its DNA structure. So when you vaccinate people against that, using a funny example that people across the political spectrum can appreciate, then we target people with the real ones, and we find they become better at it. Why give illegal immigrants access to social services? We should be helping homeless Americans, false dilemma, and so on. Now we use those ad spaces to poll people to see if they actually got it, right? They got a quiz. And it wasn't direct. There was about a median delay of 24 hours. So people saw this 30-second ad, 24 hours go by, and then they get this test. And then here are the results. So it's about a 5 to 10% boost. People are distracted on social media, on YouTube, on the bathroom, in the shower. I don't know what you're doing, but 5 to 10%. Now I was like, okay, that's not huge. Um, but then I learned companies pay millions for a 1% increase in brand recognition. They know that if you're on YouTube and you remember the brand by 1% extra or something, they know the increase in sales that will follow if enough people see it. And so for a single ad to have a 5 to 10% increase, I mean that relatively speaking, that was pretty good. And it's really cheap to run these ads. We're talking about 2 cents, 5 cents. Um, and so Google decided to scale this on its own. They did campaigns in Germany, Eastern Europe. They reached hundreds of millions of people with this approach. They replicate, decontextualizing, fear-mongering, whataboutism. They reproduced very similar effects to what we saw in our studies. They did it during elections in Europe. We're now trialing it on Instagram. Um, I should say it's not all good. They never made those ads mandatory so that you can't skip it. That was too, they're very libertarian in their orientation. So the idea, but this is the funny thing to me, right? That, oh, if you're Coca-Cola and you're targeting kids, then not being able to skip the ad, that's okay in terms of restricting people's freedom. But an educational video, wow, that's too far. And so that asymmetry in what motivates them at the end of the day, because these videos don't make any profits, right? And so that's a huge barrier to implementation. And so Google's still doing what they can, but Jigsaw, I should say, the research arm, and they're really motivated, but they're being, muzzled by all the people on top. We actually went to vulnerable regions in Iraq to do some radicalization. So areas formerly occupied by ISIS. There's a playbook. You identify vulnerable people, you gain their trust, you isolate them, you activate them on behalf of the cause. Far right organizations use the same playbook. You can inoculate people by exposing the playbook. We do this with simulated WhatsApp conversations of trying to get people to radicalize them in your organization. It works in the same way. We wrote a handbook for NATO. Deepfakes, just did an experiment with our undergraduates, also works for deepfakes. We're trying to automate it with AI. The last thing I'll say is that Biden used our model against Putin. Now, I'm relying on intelligence community insights, not scientific research, but they warned people in advance. They used a forewarning saying there's going to be a a fake pretext for an invasion. They're going to show graphic videos of Ukrainian soldiers on Russian soil, but you should know these are actors. This is a propaganda video. Here's how you can know it's fake. And they did that preemptively. I mean, this was a joint US-UK operation. They usually sit on this kind of intelligence because they didn't know it was 100% true. They thought this was coming, and they thought the evidence was credible enough that it was worth pre-bunking. And they say that they derailed the invasion using this pre-bunk. And of course, Putin still invaded. He just found a new pretext. But at least you bought some time, which for a social psychological intervention is not bad. It's been written into the Digital Services Act in Europe. And now we're looking at immunization models. Again, coming back to this, right? So population level dynamics. We know the effect sizes. We know it wears off over time. Now we can integrate it into viral models at population level. Here's how the misinformation spreads. Here's how many people become disinformed. Here's how effective the vaccine is. How does this evolve over time using different assumptions in the model, right? And you can get these plots. The peak disinformed, peak immunized. How can this inform social policy? So that's kind of where we're at now. It's taken up too much time already. I'm happy to answer tons of questions in case they arise. Thanks so much for your attention and listening.
Okay. Sandra, that was amazing. Thank you so much. That's just I can't it's dizzying the amount of work you've managed to accomplish and the places you've been able to take your work in the real world. Really, really fabulous thing. We've got some questions if you're willing to do so. I'll
Of
start
course,
you
yeah, yeah.
off with an easy one. I think you've touched on it. I noticed first of all I loved the book. It was great and a very good read. And it even has a little bit of intrigue in it. There's like secret pub meetings with somebody who ended up tossing the 2016 election or something. I don't know. I may have gotten that wrong, but it's a great read. The you know, so much of what's going on at the moment, much of your work is with text-based stuff. And of course, the latest thing is these deep fakes and AI images. And it sounds you did touch on something here near the end. It sounds like you're starting to get into that as well. Do you find the techniques that you are started out with are applicable in the same way to image-based or audio-based misinformation?
Not quite. A little bit. So we have a paper that didn't talk about multimodal misinformation. We had a game for that with the State Department that was taken down by the Trump administration, I think. But we put it on a different server, which is much more about visuals. That showed similar effects, but there are challenges. So with deepfakes, for example, I didn't talk too much about it because it's not, it's in development. It took me a long time to get to the deepfakes because for inoculation isn't suited for all contexts. I think it works best when there are discernible tactics being used that are predictable that you can preempt. And with deepfakes, you don't want to use cues that are going to be outdated, a week from now, because the technology changes so fast. So we were struggling to come up with an inoculation that could sort of withstand the test of time on that. It's essentially a variant of impersonation, right? So you can have people go through an impersonation module. But in the vaccine analogy, that vaccine might be too outdated to confer enough protection against this new variant of Gen AI deepfakes. That would be my assumption. So what I did in this experiment that I showed on the slide briefly was actually we took a specific set of deepfakes where there is a technique that's being used, like a face swap or something, and they all use that technique. And so what we find is that the inoculation works really well when there is such a technique that's being used. Now, some deepfakes don't have a discernible technique. It's just impossible to tell almost what's going on. And so in those cases, I think we're struggling with how to make inoculation work. We're now trying to do implicit sort of triggering implicit detection mechanisms that people might have on their own that they're not aware of. We're trying context, like does this make sense in this would the Pope wear a puff jacket, for example? But it's more difficult and it's a struggle. But for the classes of audio fakes, deep fakes that do use a trick repeatedly, inoculation works well. But for the ones where you just can't see anything or there's no context that you can leverage, those are the ones that are the trickiest, and we're still trying to think of the best way to get at those. But yeah, it's a great
Yeah.
question.
Good. Yeah, well, I can see that. There are a number of questions here, so I'm going to start to go through the audience questions. This is from Josh Coover Kibi, I think. I'm currently doing a thesis, the state of protection in the place for vulnerable populations who use digital media, a systematic review. Do you think we have enough digital media protections for vulnerable populations like children, the elderly, and poorly educated?
No, no, absolutely not. That's a great point. I didn't talk about this, but we did some experiments in rural areas in Brazil and in India where literacy levels are very low, and some of the stuff didn't work at all because a lot of our interventions use meta humor and an intuitive understanding of memes on social media. But in rural areas, people use social media for entirely different reasons. Some people may not even know how to read certain things, right? And we realized we spent years and years trying to adapt our interventions to specific local cultural contexts because you do have to adapt them in different areas, and particularly in contexts where digital literacy is very low. Um, we've done stuff in prisons with vulnerable populations. We're thinking about kids as well, working with developmental psychologists. Kids are vulnerable to this stuff. AI also, how do you develop curriculums, right? So we do have a kids version of Bad News called Bad News Junior, um, that is more age appropriate. But there isn't a lot of evidence in general on misinformation interventions for vulnerable populations, and specifically for inoculation. There's very little work, and so I think that is kind of an emerging area where people are starting to look into how can we adapt this to empower vulnerable populations better. But it's a challenge because you can't just work with prisons as a psychologist. I mean, it takes a long time to get ethics, oversight committees, paperwork. It just takes a tremendous amount of time, and you need to work with research groups that have already built that expertise. So that's what we're trying to do at the moment. But yeah, it's a very good question, but I would say the evidence is limited.
Okay. All right, here's another. This is coming at it from a slightly different angle. This is Pamela Coslin is asking, is there a way to teach AI to reject consideration of disinformation in its large language model learning? Trump, the BBB, contained prohibition of state AI regulation, but it's been removed from the Senate version of the bill. Apparently, Putin and Russia is flooding the internet with pro-authoritarian disinformation that anything Trump does is by definition legal and proper, and a sizable fraction of the internet data on Trump promotes this disinformation. So anyway, this is a less of a psychological question than it is about, the input, right? Can we thwart the input by changing the way the AIs collect their data?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So it's a great question. So the Russia stuff, yeah, that's the fire hose model of propaganda, which is to overwhelm just the discourse, which is a well-known tactic that they use. We're actually currently trying to devise inoculations for the fire hose model as a technique. But to the question about AI, so some very clever researchers in computer science took our inoculation idea and it has legs in interesting ways. So they said, why just humans? We need to inoculate AI systems. And so what they did was they took the analogy and they call it model immunization. So they take large language models, and what they find is that if they haven't been immunized, like Grok, for example, they start spouting out white genocide conspiracy theories because they've never come across them and they're just generating them, right? But models that have been immunized, and what they do is they take what they call a quarantined data set of neutralized falsehoods, neutralized meaning they have been labeled as false in the training data, clearly labeled as false, and they take that quarantine set, then they fine tune the large language model with that quarantined weakened dose kind of database. Um, to immunize the large language model against prompts to either produce misinformation or generate it spontaneously. And they find that it produces less misinformation if it's been if it's been fine-tuned with immunization practices versus the baseline kind of large language models that we have now. So it's very interesting that I think you can take the inoculation approach that we have done with humans and apply them to large language models in the same way.
That's wonderful. Yeah, you just need to have the companies have the incentive to apply something like
Mm,
that to their that's a different question, I
that's the
suppose.
big question, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to summarize. This next one is from Rona Bosson, and I think what she's basically asking is, are people who are comfortable with manipulating other people more susceptible to being manipulated themselves? I think that's basically the question that she's asking. I don't know.
Wow, that's a good question. So are people comfortable with manipulating other people more susceptible to manipulation themselves? I mean, it's a good question. I don't know. My hunch would be that people who are comfortable manipulating other people are actually quite aware of the tactics that they use to manipulate other people, which should, in
Mhm.
theory, make them a little bit more immune to when it's deployed on themselves. Because if you practice manipulation on other people all the time, then you're going to be recognizing those techniques. Of course, it's an unethical way to do this because you're using the full dose of manipulation, which, kind of like taking the actual virus in. The better way would be to use the weakened metaphor. But yeah, I think that those people would be less susceptible to
Yeah.
to being manipulated themselves. Although. I think it depends on what we're talking about. So people who believe in conspiracy theories, for example, think that they're doing a lot of research and thinking, but actually they're quite susceptible to falling prey to logical fallacies. But I think conspiracy theories are a bit different from interpersonal manipulation. So yeah, I guess it depends a little bit about what we're saying. I think if you're just talking about people who spread a lot of misinformation, they are more susceptible themselves. But professional manipulators are
Mm.
probably more immune to manipulation, if that makes sense.
That's a very good way of thinking about it. I agree with that. Here is Blair Bingham. Thank you so much for your work. I love your book.
Well,
Do
thank
you
you.
find, and I think I know the answer to this one, do you find challenges in being able to access data from platforms like YouTube for research? I noticed many Twitter studies, but with changes to X, et cetera, can you scrape data for your research?
Yeah, great question. No, I mean we're facing massive challenges right now. All the studies I've showed you were pre-Musk, the Twitter studies. So yeah, Musk made the API unaffordable for most scientists. I mean, we're in a lucky position to have some funding left, and it was almost a moral thing not to do it. But it was between a PhD student finishing their work and boycotting Elon Musk. But I had to make the tough decision of paying Elon's company what they were asking for a tiny amount of data for a outrageous price, which we just had to get in order to finish the project. So I'm never intending to pay him any further diamond in the future. But yeah, it's just we're not getting any data from Twitter. Facebook has a new API that's more restrictive. YouTube has opened up an API actually, but what you can get at the moment, it's very limited. It's much more restricted. So the whole research community is facing issues with accessing data, which then leads to less transparency. We don't know what's going on. It's very difficult to audit, and that's just it's a big problem right now. So yeah, what we're trying to do is find other ways of getting at it. Tell it, other platforms that are more accessible, like Reddit is a little bit more accessible. Um, and places like Telegram where you can still scrape. So yeah, it's there's not a lot going on in that sphere because it's so difficult to get access to data. So yeah, we're trying to do what we can, but we're mostly talking to legislators about enforcing transparency
Hmm.
for
That's
independent research and journalism.
sounds like a good approach. Okay, here's Richard Yeager. How effective can inoculation be regarding subject matter that takes a higher level of technical knowledge to understand? Electronics, physics, math, medicine, economics, etc.
Yeah, that's a great question. Uh, I found that when we're dealing with very complex stuff, it's you need to spend a lot of time about being clear. And but what I mean with complex is that when there's no clear technique or when there's no actual consensus, but when the science is actually uncertain and more complex and gray area, then you can't, then you can't just say this or that, right? So it has to be a much more complex story. And then there's a risk of losing people. So how can you be nuanced at the same time? So it's possible, and we've done it. It just requires a lot more time about how do you convey that message in a succinct way that is still accurate and gets the basic point across? What analogies, what metaphors can you use to make the inoculation interesting, engaging, without losing accuracy? Um, but yeah, it is possible. I mean, we've done it on very nuanced, more complex sort of issues, but it just takes a lot more time to get it right. But I would say it is possible and it does work, but you want to minimize the risk of confusion when you do that because you don't want people to come out more confused than they went in. So it just requires spending more time with subject matter experts in condensing it in a succinct, engaging way that is still accurate. And you know. Often when I look at people, I mean, we've got great people in the skeptic community, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Bill Nye, who are expert at taking extremely complex issues and explaining them in a clear and accurate way. And so we often find like teaming up with influencers in that way can really help um, a complex inoculation be accessible, make it more accessible to the public.
That's great. I think we'll just take one or two more on how. Here's Martin Mratz. How might one use these pre-bump techniques in person with people who may trust us but who operate from different information spheres? You covered this
Yeah,
a
yeah.
bit in the book.
Yeah, the publisher was keen on doing that because I think it's the useful information for people, right, in the pub. So we have this one video where we try to act it out. This one campaign where people are sitting in the pub and they get get a text about some news headline, and then somebody says like, "Hey, have you heard about this thing called scapegoating?" I said, "No, like, you know how in South Park they always blame the Canadians for everything." And it's sort of, it's sort of a funny way to start the conversation. And then, because you don't want to start off by saying like, oh, they're always talking about immigrants, and so on. And so you want to keep it at, what I found is that you want to, well, let me say actually what I write in the book, which is perhaps um, a better approach, is that you want to identify the stage that people are in so you can meet them where they are. Is this somebody who's never been exposed to misinformation, somebody who's entertaining it but not yet convinced, or are you talking to somebody who's fully radicalized? That will help you determine what type of inoculation is going to work best. So specific narrow spectrum inoculations don't work as well on people who are already convinced of something else because there's a chance that they don't want to hear the factual information that you're going to bring them. So you can shift more towards a technique-based inoculation, which is more meta level. So for example, if you want to talk about immigration, throwing immigration facts at people isn't necessarily going to do the trick. You might want to start off explaining scapegoating with the South Park example. That's kind of funny. And then people, oh yeah, yeah, I get that. Okay, and then slowly pivot, right, towards a specific context, and keep it at that sort of level. Like I'm not telling you what to believe. I'm just saying there are these techniques out there, and we want to use that to form our own opinions. And that kind of indirect broad spectrum approach works better for people who are already kind of bought into a particular falsehood. Whereas for people who have not really been exposed, but they just kind of vaguely heard about something, then actually a very specific inoculation is going to be most beneficial to that kind of crowd. Um, and so yeah, so you want to pick your tools depending, and so you have to suss out. I ask people questions. Where have you heard this? How confident are you about that this is true? I try to find out how convinced are they, where did they hear it from, what stage are they in, and then I try to tailor the right inoculation approach for that person. If they're already radicalized, inoculation is not going to be that useful. But you want to interpersonally, you want to keep things empathetic. You don't want people to, get their defenses up. I think the main mistake people make with debunking is just kind of saying like, you're wrong, you're an idiot, these are the facts, this is what you need to do. And people will just double down and feel offended. And so I think you need to find a bridge. You need to find some relatable example that explains manipulation. When I talk to conspiracy theorists, I often talk about Alex Jones. Like this guy has been telling people that the Sandy Hook shooting was crisis actors, and then he goes in court and says, that it was real after all. So for years, he's manipulated his audience. He's making money off of people. Like you don't want to be someone who are making money out. So conspiracy theorists hate being manipulated. They hate being part of it. So I talk about multi-level marketing schemes. People at the top floating theories. People at the bottom, dealing with the cost of it. You don't want to be part of a multi-level marketing scheme. You're a smart guy, right? And so conspiracy theorists they hate that, and so they're more likely to then say like, oh yeah, 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 and so and then you leave it there. And then you pick it up next time. Because I also think about pushing people too far. We have this need to convince people in the moment. I think
Mm.
you take a small win, you leave it there, and you pick it up, and that's how you maintain a good, I think, interpersonal relationship without alienating people, and then just chip away with the immunization over time. Yeah, that was kind of a long answer, but
But
yeah.
it's good. I think that a lot of good advice there. I think that one of the great benefits of your approach is that much of it is technique based. You're identifying the techniques and methods which can apply to any, argumentative situation. That's good. Okay, so here's the last question, which I'm going to take the privilege of asking, then we'll let you go to sleep. So sometimes the process of evaluating information is slow. It may not be clear at the outset what the truth is. Climate change should be clear, vaccines should be clear, but some reasonable people still debate the lab leak versus natural, spillover. Early in the pandemic, we were washing down boxes, wiping down boxes because we thought that was that. We later found out that was wrong. Any uncertainty in a situation is often seized upon by the merchants of doubt. So, do you have any thoughts about improving the basic tolerance for uncertainty in those situations where it seems like the right thing?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I've been involved in the lab leak debate in many ways that I wish I hadn't. But I my thing was what I was trying to communicate, and this is about actually not just the lab leak. Take Hunter Biden and Biden's age and all of those
Mhm.
things. I think, what I tried to communicate is that they don't just say it's not about whether Biden has dementia now or in the future. Things change, right? You might not have dementia uh, 5 years ago. You might have it now, especially if you're elderly, right? It's not that that's always going to be the same thing. But more importantly, it's a propaganda technique. They say that Elizabeth, Hillary Clinton wasn't mentally fit to be president, and then also Nancy Pelosi, right? And so it's also Trump. People say, right? So actually, this mental health accusation is a propaganda technique that's used over and again, and that's independent of actual veracity. I think that's the hard thing for people to have to wrap their head around is that, yeah, sometimes it's going to be true. Maybe now in the future, as we age, we're all going to develop age-related. Most of us are going to develop age-related memory decline, and so at some point, it's going to be true. But that doesn't mean that somebody isn't using a propaganda technique, right? And that's the hard thing for me. I found that very hard that people seem to be able to conflate the two, like, oh, we're being lied to because, you know, Biden can't remember things or something like that, right? And so it's you have to separate those out, right? That at the time that he was elected, it was absolutely fine. There's no doctors have looked at it and have said he doesn't have a neurological disease. I mean, I'm a psychologist, so I take that accusation very seriously, right? He did not have any neurological disease from what we can see in terms of medical assessments, right? If your judgment as a citizen is this person's too old to be president, doesn't seem to be very confused, that's totally fine, right? That's how people vote. Um, but to say that somebody has a disease, right, that without proper medical knowledge, that's just misinformation. And then people get angry that you label it misinformation. But I think, that's the nuance, right? That the scientific nuance that's hard for people to get. Same with the lab leak. That the bio version, nobody endorsed that it's a bio weapon that's been created. It'd be the dumbest bio weapon ever because it attacks everyone almost, right? Especially the countries that are supposed to have come up with it. Like, why would they create a bio weapon that attacks their own people? Doesn't make any sense, right? Now, communication could have been better about the lab leak possibility. I think the problem was they didn't filter out the conspiracy version from implausible but still scientific hypothesis version. And so there was some uncertainty, some nuance that got lost there. Then again, it became this story of, oh, but we were lied to because now the lab leak is plausible. No, it was always plausible. It was not likely. And the conspiracy was the bioweapon version. And I think that with all of these examples, I found it very frustrating that the nuance gets lost and the uncertainty is tied up in it. And so this concept that you may be well familiar with of actively open-minded thinking, I think is absolutely crucial. Seems to be the antidote to conspiratorial thinking, which is the ability to hold, lines of evidence in your head with amount of uncertainty, to be able to take other people's perspective, to be able to be comfortable with competing explanations. That's hard for people, right? To be open-minded. And people talk to me about Epstein. I don't know. Like, it seems like, it was suspicious, right? I keep an open mind. I'm not endorsing any conspiracy theories. I'm skeptical of some of the narratives, as you should be, as a good healthy scientific skepticism, until more evidence, but until that point, you have to deal with uncertainty. You have to be open to different explanations, non-conspiratorial explanations. You have to place the weight of evidence, right? There are tapes. I know people who've heard them inside the intelligence community. They're very nasty. Now I'm calibrating my own prior, saying that, yeah, he did probably kill himself, and they were just, not releasing that information at the time, right? And that's how I think people should think about these things. Not that no conspiracy can ever be true. And Michael Shermer and I have had disagreements about conspiracy theories in the sense that I don't think we need to investigate them all. I think, most of them are nonsense because they follow a pattern. But you have to be open-minded in the sense that they're constructed so that they can never be fully debunked. That's their whole spiel, right? That you can never know. Somebody can always be plotting something behind the scenes, right? But that's not the point. But you have to be open-minded and go where the evidence is, right? Conspiracy, what amazing. What
What's that? Is Are you hearing something? Sandra, are you?
Oh, sorry. I was getting some very strange interference in
Oh, okay.
my
Oh, okay. Sorry.
it might be a conspiracy actually. Let me just shut this down. I don't know
Okay.
what is going on. Some ad is playing. Um,
Huh.
sorry about this. I can't seem to find where this is coming from. I was talking about conspiracy theories, and all of a sudden, there's interference. Sorry. Yeah,
Well,
I'll just quickly
we
quickly finish what I was
sure.
saying. It was just I guess my point is that being skeptical, being open-minded, not jumping to conspiracy theories, that's and placing weight of evidence and maintaining nuance, right? I think that's the antidote, and that's what we want to bake into these inoculations is that we don't want to tell people 100% this is true or false. We just want to show people the patterns that will help them calibrate their judgments.
Right. Great. Yeah, and that is the core and the challenge of skepticism in general, in a nutshell, is open-mindedness, but also not buying into the conspiracy. So wonderful. I think we're going to let you go to bed now. Thank you so much, Sanders. This is an amazing talk. Great to hear from you and to be able to talk to you a little bit. So thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for the great questions and having me, and I look forward to keeping in touch.
Okay. Until next time,
Thanks.
folks, we'll see you. Good night,
All right.
everyone.